Montana Territory, 1882, the train whistle screamed through the mountain pass, and the last stretch of the line hissed steam into the chilled morning air. Victoria Mae Monroe stepped down from the wooden platform at the Helena station, her gloved hands trembling as she clutched her worn valise. The hem of her traveling skirt was dusted in soot, and her boots were stiff from the long ride through Missouri, the Dakota Territory, and finally up through the Rockies. She had never traveled so far, never been alone this long, but she was here now. She had meant every word in those letters. She searched the platform, scanning the small crowd of men in hats and coats, most of them waiting on freight or family. Then, through the steam and the quiet bustle, a man stepped forward. He was taller than she had expected, lean but strong-looking, with a weather-darkened coat and a clean white shirt buttoned to the collar. His hair was the color of prairie soil, and his eyes, when they met hers, held something steady and kind. He smiled, not wide but warm, like he meant it. "Kassian Dorsey," he said, voice low and clear. "You must be Victoria," she nodded, chest tight with nerves. "Yes, sir, Victoria Monroe." He reached for her valise, careful in the way he took it from her hands. "Welcome to Montana." "My wagon's just around the corner." She followed him in silence, boots crunching over gravel as the cold wind swept across the hills. He helped her up into the wagon without hesitation, then climbed in beside her, the horses shifting beneath the reins. "You warm enough?" he asked, glancing sideways. "I will be." She tucked her hands beneath her shawl. "Thank you for meeting me," he gave a small nod. "I promised I would." The ride to his homestead took over an hour, the sky stretching wide above the rolling land, soft golds and blues melting into the snow-dusted earth. There was nothing but the wind, the sound of the wheels, and the occasional jingle of the harness. They did not speak much on the road. She was grateful for that. It gave her time to settle her thoughts, to look at the man who until now had only existed in letters. He was not a talker, that much was clear, but he was not cold either. When the wind blew too sharp, he offered her his coat without a word. She took it, the wool heavy and warm against her shoulders. His homestead sat nestled against a line of pine trees, a modest house with a slanted roof, 2 outbuildings, and smoke curling from the chimney. The porch was swept clean, and the front door stood open as he climbed down to help her. "Come on," he said, offering his hand. "Get out of the cold." She took it, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. Inside, the cabin was simple wood plank floors, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with canned preserves, and a rocking chair by the hearth. It smelled of pine, ash, and something faintly sweet. Bread, maybe. "I set the fire early," he said, setting her valise by the wall. "Figured you'd be chilled coming off the train." She turned slowly, taking everything in. "This is your home." He nodded again, then looked at her with that same quiet steadiness. "It is. If you want it, it can be yours too," Victoria blinked. "Just like that, you came all this way." "I figure you meant it." He paused. "You are not what I expected, but I think that is a good thing." She smiled, faint but real. "You are not what I expected either." Something softened in his face then, not a grin, not even a full smile, but a gentling. "I will show you around," he said. "Then I will let you rest." The next few days passed in a rhythm both new and oddly familiar. Victoria learned the creak of the door hinges, the crackle of the stove, the way the sun cast long shadows across the floorboards each afternoon. Kassian was not a man of many words, but he was a man of action. He mended a broken shutter before she could ask. He brought her hot tea each morning before chores. He gave her space but not distance. And when she stood outside at dusk, watching the sun dip behind the hills, he stood beside her without saying a thing. On the 4th day, she found the letter. It was tucked in a small drawer, one she opened while putting away linens. It was addressed in a child's handwriting, wobbly, unsure. And beneath it, a second letter, this one in a woman's handwriting. The name signed at the bottom made her chest ache. Clara Dorsey. She left the letters where they were and waited until evening. After supper, while he scrubbed the dish basin, she sat at the table and folded her hands. "You had a wife," she said softly. He stopped, water dripping from his hands. "Yes." "And a daughter." His shoulders sank just slightly. Lydia, she was 5, Clara died of fever. Lydia was taken by her sister, meant to keep her safe, but she ran off, left her behind somewhere in Kansas. I tried to find her. No one knew where she had gone. Victoria's voice was quiet. You tried. I did. Every day I regret not going sooner. She stood and crossed to him, resting a hand near his on the counter. You are not the only one who has lost. He looked at her then, eyes darker with memory. I never meant to marry again, but when I read your letters. What changed your mind? You wrote like someone who understood silence. Victoria felt tears sting behind her eyes. I do. He reached up, touched her cheek with the back of his fingers, slow and careful. You do not have to stay, Victoria, but if you choose to, it will be your home too. She leaned into his touch, heart thudding. I already chose. That night she stood in the doorway, watching him stack wood by the fire. He looked up when he felt her gaze, and for the first time he smiled full. You all right? He asked. I am more than all right. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He crossed to her, set a hand on her waist. You sure about this? She nodded. I rode miles for a stranger, but I do not think you are a stranger anymore. He kissed her then, slow and real, the kind of kiss that said thank you and I see you and I want to stay. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. Welcome home, Victoria, he murmured, and with her arms wrapped around his neck, her heart steady for the first time in years, she whispered, Thank you for the open door. The first snow fell quiet one morning just after dawn. Victoria stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching the flakes drift like ash against the pale sky. The stove behind her pulsed gentle warmth into the room, and Kassian's boots thudded soft across the floor as he carried in a bucket of water from the creek. You never seen snow? He asked, setting it down near the hearth. I have, but not like this. She turned, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Back in Illinois, it always came with wind and noise. Here it feels slower. He crouched beside the stove, adding a log to the firebox. Everything moves slower here, come winter. His voice was still rough from sleep, and she found herself listening more to its rhythm than the words. She'd begun to learn the way he moved through the world, deliberate, never rushed, always watching. It felt like a kind of care she hadn't known before. She crossed to the table and began slicing bread from the loaf she'd baked the day before. He'd left her alone in the kitchen, trusting her with the flour, the salt, the fire. That trust sat warm behind her ribs. He sat down across from her, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the snow through the window. I was thinking about the barn roof, he said, needs patching before the next big fall. She passed him a slice with butter spread thick. Can you manage it before the freeze? I'll manage it either way. He took a bite, chewed, then added, could use another set of hands, though. She gave a small nod. Show me how. He looked up, surprised. You do that? I didn't come all this way to sit by the fire while you do everything alone. He didn't answer right away, just studied her face like he was trying to read something inside it. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. I'll get the ladder. By midday, the clouds had cleared and the sun threw long shadows across the yard. Victoria climbed the rungs behind Kassian, her skirts tucked up and pinned. The wind at that height stung her cheeks, but she didn't complain. He handed her a strip of canvas and pointed to the gap between the slats. Hold it steady while I nail it down. She did, her fingers stiff with cold. He worked beside her, hammer striking wood with practiced rhythm. When he finished, he leaned back on his heels and glanced over. You cold? She smiled, breath fogging the air. Yes, come on, that's enough for today. Back inside, she placed her hands near the stove while he poured water into the basin and washed the dust from his arms. She leaned against the wall, watching the way his hair curled damp at the nape of his neck, how his shirt clung to his back from the climb. You always did everything alone before, she asked. Most of it. Some neighbors come by when it's something I can't handle. He dried his hands on a cloth. But it's been quiet the last year, she hesitated. And you liked the quiet, I thought I did. He turned, and there was something unguarded in his expression now, something that felt like offering. You're not what I expected either, Victoria. I figured you'd be soft-handed, maybe uneasy with the work, but you don't blink at it. I've had to work since I was 13, she said. A father with debts and too much pride, a mother who wore herself thin trying to keep us fed. I learned early that no one was coming to save me. I stopped waiting. He stepped closer, slow and sure, until their boots nearly touched. I'm not trying to save you, he said, but I'll carry what I can with you. The words settled between them like something sacred. Later that evening, after supper and quiet, Kassian pulled a wool blanket from the chest beside the bed and unfolded it over her shoulders where she sat reading by lantern light. I was thinking, he said, about building a room off the back, something with more space. If you're staying, she closed the book, hands tucked under the blanket. You're planning ahead, I want to. He shifted his weight. There's things I never thought I'd do again, but I find myself thinking about them now. She looked up, the firelight catching in her eyes. Like what? A second planting bed, a smokehouse, a cradle, her breath caught. You'd want children again, he nodded slow. If you did. She reached for his hand, fingers slipping into his with quiet certainty. I do. He lowered himself beside her, the lantern flickering shadows across his face. They didn't speak again that night, just sat close, the hush of snow outside wrapping around the cabin while something steady and sure settled between them, not hope exactly, something stronger. Something already growing. By late January, the ground had frozen through. The sun rose slow and pale each morning, casting long blue shadows across the clearing behind the house. Victoria had taken to waking before Kassian, lighting the stove and kneading dough while the cabin was still quiet. He'd told her once he liked the sound of her moving through the morning, said it reminded him of something he couldn't name but had missed. One afternoon, while snow thickened over the tree line and the wind pushed against the windows in sighing gusts, Kassian came in carrying a box wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table and pulled off his gloves. I stopped by the post shack yesterday, he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. Figured you'd want this. Victoria wiped her hands on a cloth and approached the box slowly. I wasn't expecting anything, came from Peoria, your name on it. She unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a small wooden frame with a pressed flower behind glass, edges browned from age. Beneath it, folded in a square of linen, were 3 letters tied with twine. Her breath caught. My sister sent these, she said, voice low. She's in Chicago now. I haven't heard from her since I left. Kassian stepped back, giving her space. I'll chop kindling. Take your time. She sat down, turning the frame over in her hands. The flower, faded lilac, had come from their mother's garden. The last time she'd seen it bloom, she'd still been a girl. Her fingers trembled as she untied the twine. The letters weren't long. Her sister wrote of factory work, of smoke and crowds and aching feet, of missing her and hoping she'd found someone who saw her clearly. At the end of the last page, there was a sentence written in cramped script, one that made her throat tighten. I hope you are somewhere with Sky. When Kassian came back in, brushing ice from his collar, she stood and met his gaze. Would you help me hang this? He took the frame from her hands and looked at the flower a long moment. Where? Above the bed. Where the sun hits in the morning, he nodded. We'll do that. That evening, after the light had gone and the fire settled into coals, Victoria pulled a small bundle of fabric from her chest and carried it to the table. She laid it flat across the planks, smoothing the corners with quiet care. I started something, she said. Didn't know if I'd finish it. Thought maybe now's the time. Kassian set down his tin mug and crossed the room. The bundle unfolded into a quilt top, pieces of calico and wool sewn in uneven rows. Some patches were worn old dress hems, a sleeve cuff, a bit of flannel faded to gray. I stitched it on trains, between stops, when the silence felt too big. He didn't touch it at first, just looked at the threadwork, the uneven seams, the way each piece had been chosen. You want it for the bed? He asked. No, I want it for the cradle. He looked up at her then, eyes steady and unreadable. You sure? I wouldn't have brought it if I wasn't. He reached for her hand, calloused palm closing around her fingers. Then it'll be ready when the time comes. She didn't say anything else, just leaned into his side as he folded the quilt top again, the weight of it soft in his arms. The next day, Victoria followed him into the shed behind the barn, her boots crunching over packed snow. The inside smelled of cedar and cold iron. He pulled a tarp off a stack of boards and drew out a narrow length of pine. "I've got some plans," he said. "For the cradle, figured I'd start with this." She looked at the wood, then at him. "You've built one before, once. Will you do it different this time?" He hesitated. "I think I'll use pegs instead of nails, want it stronger." She reached out and traced the edge of the board with her gloved hand. "I'd like to help. You ever used a draw knife?" "No." "But I can learn." He looked at her then, not surprised, but something close to moved. "All right, we'll start tomorrow." That night they sat at the table long after supper, oil lamp burning low, talking about names. She spoke of her grandmother's garden, the one with hollyhocks so tall they reached the windows. He spoke of a creek he'd camped beside once, where the water ran so clear it mirrored the stars. They didn't decide on anything, but they didn't need to. There was time. When the fire burned low and the hour grew late, they stood together by the window, watching the moon rise over the white hills. He wrapped his arm around her waist and she leaned into his warmth. "You afraid?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No." "Not anymore." He kissed her temple, the press of it steady and real. "Neither am I." The snow began to soften by early March, seeping into the soil in slow rivulets that pooled along the edges of the garden beds. The wind still carried a bite, but by midday, the sun held long enough to warm the porch steps. Victoria had taken to sitting there after chores, her back against the rail, mending a shirt or simply letting her eyes rest on the horizon. That morning, Kassian came back from the West Ridge with a cut across his forearm and a quiet tension in his jaw. "Barbed wire," he said, setting the coil of fencing down by the barn wall. "Snapped while I was pulling it straight." Victoria took one look at the thin red line and said, "Come inside." He didn't argue, just followed her into the cabin and sat at the table while she fetched the tin of salve from the shelf. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and wrapped it with a strip of muslin, tying it snugly before resting her hand lightly on his wrist. "You should have let me come with you," she said. "Didn't think it'd take more than an hour." "I'd rather you take 2 and come back whole." He looked at her then, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You speak like you've had to wait for someone who didn't." "I have." He didn't ask who, didn't need to. After a moment he said, "There's a man down in Fort Benton, name of Cooley. He's hauling lumber and hardware up this way in a few weeks. I was thinking we could ride in and meet him. Pick out wood for the room addition." Victoria nodded slowly. "You want me to come? You'd be the one living in it. I figure it ought to be built to your liking." She sat back, folding the cloth into the tin. "Then I'll make a list." He leaned forward slightly. "You ever been to Fort Benton?" "No." "Closest I got was seeing it marked on a rail map. You'll hear riverboats long before you see 'em, and the streets'll be mud clear through spring." He paused. "But there's a shop that sells bolts of cotton and a woman who makes toffee in a kettle out behind the mercantile." Victoria's mouth curved. "You've tried it once." "It stuck to my teeth for half the morning. I'll bring a coin for that woman." The morning of the trip, they left before sunup, bundled in coats with dried apples packed into a sack between them. The road unfolded in long strips of brown and slush, and Kassian kept the horses at an easy pace. Victoria watched the land change as they descended from the hills, the trees thinning into scrub, the wind carrying the scent of thawed riverbanks. They reached the outskirts of Fort Benton before noon. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the clang of hammers echoed from the ferry dock. Kassian helped her down from the seat, his hand steady at her waist, and led her toward the lumber yard. The foreman, a thick-shouldered man with a half-buttoned coat, raised a hand in greeting. "Dorsey, heard you were looking to build." "That's right." "Need dry pine, dozen lengths, and 4 beams." The man turned toward Victoria. "Wife," Kassian didn't flinch. "Victoria," she nodded once. "We'll need cedar for the window frames and iron hinges, the kind with the flat backplate." The man's eyebrows lifted, but he didn't argue. "I'll note it down." They spent the next hour walking the yard, inspecting boards and discussing joint fits. Kassian asked her opinion on the grain of the wood, and when she pointed out a hairline crack near one end, he nodded and set it aside without a word. Her chest warmed at being trusted, not humored. When their order was tallied and scheduled for delivery, Kassian turned to her. "Still want that toffee?" They found the woman behind the mercantile, apron dusted in sugar and steam rising from a copper pot. Victoria bought 2 wrapped sticks and handed Kassian one. He took a bite and winced. "Still sticks." She laughed, a sound that surprised them both. On the ride home, the sun dipped behind a bank of early clouds and mist began to settle low along the road. Victoria pulled her coat tighter, the wind sneaking through the seams, and Kassian reached behind the bench for the extra shawl he kept folded beneath the tools. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. She looked over at him, his profile set against the fading sky. "You always carry extra, learn to. Weather changes fast out here, so do people." He glanced at her, then back toward the road. "You haven't." She shifted closer on the bench, the shawl's edge slipping between them. "Neither have you." They didn't speak the rest of the way, but she rested her hand on his thigh and he covered it with his own. That night, as they sat by the fire, Victoria unwrapped the second toffee stick and set it on the mantel. "For the cradle," she said. Kassian looked at the small, sweet shape, then at her. "You think we'll need it soon?" She met his gaze. "I think we might already." His eyes didn't widen, just softened in a way that made her breath catch. "If that's so," he said, "then I'll build it ready," and she believed him, without doubt. Without fear. The first soft buds had started to show along the edge of the creek by the time Kassian raised the frame of the new room. Victoria watched from the doorway, arms crossed beneath her apron, the scent of wet earth rising from the thawing ground. The pine boards lay stacked in orderly rows, and the hammering echoed into the hills with a rhythm that felt like progress, like planting something that would last. He worked alongside a neighbor from 2 ridges over, a quiet man with a limp and a tin of nails always in his coat pocket. They didn't speak much, but the work moved quickly between them. Victoria brought out bread and boiled eggs wrapped in cloth, and the men paused only long enough to eat with their backs to the wind. Inside, she had begun clearing the corner of the cabin where the cradle would rest once finished. There was a narrow shelf there now, and she lined it with folded muslin, a small tin of balm, and a carved wooden rattle Kassian had once made for Lydia. He hadn't spoken of it directly, but she had found it wrapped in flannel one evening, left atop the cradle base in the shed. His quiet offering. Later that week, a letter arrived from her sister, carried up by a trapper passing through. Victoria read it slowly by the fire, one hand resting on her belly now beginning to round with new life. The letter told of a move to a boarding house on the west side of the city and work at a dressmaker's shop. At the bottom, there was a line that made Victoria pause. "If you found peace, then stay in it." "I never did trust the world to hand it over twice." Kassian glanced up from the whittling knife he was honing. "Good news, she's well enough," Victoria said, folding the page. "And she wants me to be too." He set the blade aside. "You are." In the days that followed, the weather turned warm enough for Kassian to begin sanding the cradle's slats outside. Victoria sat nearby on a low stool, mending seams and watching the way his hands moved across the wood. He didn't rush. Each stroke was even, careful. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked, not looking up. She tied off her thread. "No, not even for a visit. There's nothing left of mine there, not really." She reached for another shirt. "But I've thought about writing to the woman who took Lydia, not to accuse. Just to ask." Kassian's hands stilled. "You think she'll answer?" "I don't know, but I think you should have the truth." He nodded once, slow. "If you write it, I'll send it." That night, after the supper dishes were cleared, Victoria took a sheet of paper and set it on the table. Kassian didn't hover. He brought her a cup of warm milk and kissed her shoulder before leaving her to the quiet. She wrote with care, her script small and even, asking only what had happened and where the girl might have gone. She signed it with both their names. Weeks passed. The room was finished, windows fitted, and a single bedstead brought in from the attic of a neighbor's barn. Victoria sewed curtains from a bolt of cotton she'd chosen in Fort Benton, pale green with a faint vine pattern. The cradle stood beneath the window now, smoothed and polished, the quilt they'd finished laid across the mattress. It was a warm afternoon when the trapper returned, this time with a reply. The envelope bore a different hand than the first, and Victoria opened it with trembling fingers. She says Lydia was taken in by a family in Clay County, she read aloud. They had no children of their own. She was given their name. No one knew where she came from. Kassian sat very still. Is she well? She was enrolled in school. The teacher wrote the letter, says she's bright. Loves music, he exhaled slowly, eyes closing. That's enough. You don't want to find her, he shook his head. Not now, she's built herself something. I'll not tear through it just to quiet my own ghosts. Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. She'll come if she wants to. And if she does, we'll be here. He turned his hand palm up and threaded his fingers through hers. We will. The baby came on a quiet morning in June, just after the wild roses bloomed along the fence line. Victoria labored in the back room, Kassian never leaving her side. He held water to her lips, cooled her brow, and when the cries broke through at last, he gathered her into his arms, shaking with relief. It's a girl, he whispered, voice cracked with wonder. They named her Eliza after Victoria's mother. Kassian carved her name into the cradle rail that evening, after the house had gone still. Victoria watched him from the doorway, Eliza sleeping against her chest. In the weeks that followed, the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Kassian rose early to tend the fields while Victoria nursed Eliza by the open window, humming old lullabies she hadn't sung since childhood. Neighbors came bearing quilts and jars of pickled beans. No one stayed long, but each visit marked a thread in the life they were weaving. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned sweet with clover, Kassian led Victoria down the slope behind the barn. He'd cleared the brush and planted a row of young trees apple, he said. They'd bear fruit in a few years. She leaned against him, Eliza asleep in her sling. You think we'll still be here then? I know we will. Why? Because I've known what it is to lose everything, and I know what it is to keep it. She rested her head on his shoulder. You've kept me, he wrapped his arm around her. You kept us both. They stood there as the stars came out one by one, the trees rustling soft in the breeze, the land around them quiet and full. There was nothing left to run from, nothing left to prove, only the life they had built and the love that filled it, and they stayed. Through winters and harvests, through the growing of their daughter and the planting of more trees. And in the years that followed, they were never alone, not in grief, not in joy, not in the long, stilled hours between. They had each other, which meant they had everything.